You might think pirates spent most of their time swashbuckling on deck or burying chests full of gold, but their biggest enemy wasn't rival captains or royal navies. Nope, it was something far less glamorous: surviving blistering, hellish heat inside the cramped wooden tunnels of their own ships. That's right, before we even get to sword fights and rum, pirates had to deal with stifling conditions closer to an oven than a seafaring adventure. Let me tell you, the inside of a ship's hull could reach a staggering 60 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to fry an egg on the bulkhead, and twice as miserable for the poor souls stowed inside. And trust me, the solutions they came up with to survive that furnace were equal parts desperate, gross, and genius. You thought pirates just complained about scurvy. Wait until you hear about sweating like a pig in a floating sauna. So here's the setup. Pirate ships, those famously wooden floating monstrosities, weren't built with air conditioning or even a decent breeze in mind. The hull, basically the ship's skeleton covered in thick planks, was tight and dark, perfect for stowing cargo or prisoners and runaway crewmates. But with the sun beating down on the deck, that wood would soak up heat all day, turning those underdeck spaces into something more akin to the surface of Mercury than the Caribbean Sea. Imagine being crammed in a space no bigger than a coffin, with a dozen other guys, the air hotter than a blacksmith's forge, sweat pouring off your skin like you're caught in a monsoon of your own making. Sounds like a vacation, right? Not exactly. For a pirate crew of 50, just keeping their bodies from cooking alive was a matter of survival, not comfort. Here's something history books don't tell you. Pirates had a bigger problem than just the heat. It was the lack of ventilation and fresh water, two things that in that situation are basically life or death. Picture this: 50 sweaty men trapped below decks for hours, breathing hot, stale air, bodies soaking in their own grime, and the occasional whiff of something that probably shouldn't exist in a wooden box. Dehydration was their silent killer, sneaking up faster than a cutlass in a dark alley. Each man needed roughly 3 gallons of water daily just to survive the heat, but water stores on ships were limited and often contaminated thanks to the tropical temperatures and wooden barrels that were less watertight and more wooden sieve. Obviously, pirates tried everything to cool off, but spoiler alert, it mostly didn't work. At one point, one brilliant genius decided, hey, let's splash water on the deck and just chill under the wet planks. Bad idea. Really bad idea. The water just pooled and bred enough insects and mold to start what locals later referred to as the plague season, turning the lower decks into a breeding ground for all sorts of yucky bugs. Let's just say the combination of heat and dampness wasn't just uncomfortable, but a cocktail for fungal infections the size of grapefruits. Because nothing says fearsome pirate captain like wiggling foot fungus on full display during sword fights. Another popular but utterly failed attempt involved setting up primitive fans made from large painted sails. The problem: fans require airflow, and airflow requires open space, something pirate ships hadn't budgeted. So these fans just circulated the same hot, humid air around like a sweaty dance party nobody wanted tickets to. Their version of an air conditioner was about as effective as a sieve holding water, which means all those crew members still ended up melting in their own sweat. And you can probably guess how that ended. One particularly sweaty night, a group of pirates tried rigging a sail to catch what little breeze was under the deck, but instead it ripped away part of the wooden framework. Repairing that took a week, and morale took a nosedive quicker than a ship in a storm. But here's where it gets interesting. Pirates figured out something clever that not only helped them survive, but gave them a little leg up on their Royal Navy counterparts, who were honestly just roasting like marshmallows out there. Turns out, pirates accidentally discovered the power of natural insulation combined with strategic ventilation. Basically, a proto-air conditioner without knowing the science. By lining the inner hull with layers of cork and wet canvas, they created a barrier that absorbed heat but didn't transfer it directly into the crew quarters. Think of it like putting a giant cozy sweater around their ship's wooden ribs, but instead of keeping warm, it kept the hellish heat at bay. Pirates didn't know the physics behind it, of course, but this method reduced internal temperatures by up to 15 degrees Celsius, which, in a space topping 60 degrees, is basically the difference between dead and still breathing. Now, to get that cool air moving, they drilled tiny ventilation holes near the waterline. Yes, That sounds like a recipe for sinking, but pirates were pros at controlled leaks, and these holes allowed cooler ocean breezes to sift up through the hull. The salty sea air replaced some of the hot, stale atmosphere trapped inside, making those claustrophobic underdeck tunnels somewhat bearable. It's basically the 18th century version of a swamp cooler and worked about 70% of the time, which, considering their alternatives, was like striking gold. This innovation allowed famous captains like Bartholomew Roberts to keep their crew functional on long voyages in the blazing tropics, which was no small feat considering they once sailed from West Africa down to the Caribbean in the peak of summer. You know, pirates weren't just lounging around sipping grog. They were out there melting down below while desperately trying to avoid heat stroke. But wait, there's more. The real genius was in their water management, because cooling down without water is like, well, a pirate trying to sing sea shanties without a voice. They discovered that by storing water in barrels lined with charred oak, yes, the blackened kind, they could keep it cooler longer and slow the growth of bacteria. Pirates didn't understand microbes, but they knew burnt barrels didn't give their water that nasty swamp flavor so fast. This method increased the drinkable window of stored water from roughly 24 hours to about 48, a lifetime when you're battling heat and thirst in a cramped ship. It was basically their version of a water treatment plant, just with more smoke and less regulation. And here's a funny tidbit many history books skip. Pirates often diluted their water with small amounts of seawater to stave off dehydration when fresh water ran low. Bad idea, right? Except small amounts of salt water can trick your body into retaining fluids longer, kind of like a clumsy attempt at an electrolyte drink before Gatorade was even a twinkle in some scientist's eye. Spoiler alert, this didn't work perfectly and sometimes made crews bitterly thirsty or worse, but it was better than dying of thirst outright. One famous incident off the coast of Madagascar in 1719 had Captain John Taylor's crew drinking what they called the salted swill, which probably made their tongues peel off, but kept them just hydrated enough to survive an extra day. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation by telling tales of salted swill instead of sweet grog. Of course, not all water tricks were successes. An early attempt by a lesser-known pirate named Sila's Soggy Beard McGraw involved cooling barrels by submerging them in the ocean overnight. The ocean might sound cool, but ocean water is salty, freezing your barrels solid on one side and causing nasty cracks and leaks on the other. Let's just say when the crew woke up, half the water was a frozen mess, and the other half was leaking onto the ship's storeroom. Repairing the barrels cost 3 days and about 2 barrels of grog in labor negotiations, because pirates had priorities after all. So far, pirates had basically turned their ships into giant ovens with sauna rooms below deck, tried to wet everything down and mostly made it worse, discovered natural insulation that worked like a band-aid on. A burn started breathing salty ocean air to keep things fresh, and figured out how to store water a bit better with charred barrels. All of this before they even thought about how to keep food edible or fresh, which is a whole other mess. And if you thought surviving 60-degree heat was bad, wait until we dive into how these salty scoundrels managed to keep disease, rats, and the stench of a dozen sweaty bodies packed together from turning them into floating tombs. Because nothing tests your friendship quite like sharing a tiny space that smells like 3-day-old fish sweat mixed with unwashed wool and a hint of broken dreams. So stick around, because next up we're diving deeper into the insane, gross, and weirdly brilliant hacks pirates used to survive hellish heat in ships that were more sardine canned than seafaring fortress. Hint: it involves soaking yourself in seawater, makeshift ice using clever sailor tricks, and a gross trade-off that's basically pirate science at its best. You'll never look at pirates the same way again. Alright, let's pick up where we left off, because surviving 60 degrees Celsius heat inside a ship hull was just the start of the nightmare. Once pirates figured out some rudimentary temperature control and water storage, they had to tackle the next big villain: food preservation. Spoiler alert, it wasn't exactly a gourmet kitchen down there. Pirates relied heavily on salted meat and hard tack. Think of it as the stale cracker of doom that would haunt your dreams. The problem: salted meat, stored in barrels that were either too porous or bathed in heat, turned rancid faster than your uncle at a family reunion after 3 too many ales. The barrels, typically 63-gallon containers made from oak or pine, had about a 3.5% salt content in their cured goods, which sounds like a recipe for edible food, but was more like a lottery ticket for food poisoning. And since refrigeration was so 1710-something and never invented, pirates tried all sorts of crazy hacks. One desperate captain even tried hanging meat in wet cotton sacks over the ship's rail at night, banking on the ocean breeze to keep it fresh. Bad idea. Really bad idea. Birds swooped down and turned dinner into a shredded mess of feathers and yucky pirate stew, and the crew ended up snacking on salty sky meat until scurvy set in like an uninvited guest. But here's where pirates got a little clever, sort of like accidentally stumbling onto modern food science without realizing it. They soaked their meat barrels in seawater and buried them behind the ship's rudder where the hull was thickest and coolest. Guess what? That magical spot maintained a cooler temperature thanks to the ocean's natural cold currents and the insulation of the thick wooden ribs, cutting spoilage time by nearly half. Pirates didn't know about thermal conductivity, but we do. It's basically the 18th century version of a wine cellar or a root cellar, except the wine is salted beef, and the root cellar smells like old socks. This increased their meat's edible window from maybe 2 days to 4 or 5, which in pirate time was basically a Thanksgiving miracle. Captain Edward Blackbeard Teach was rumored to have perfected this technique around 1717 during his infamous Caribbean raids. Not only did it keep his crew fed longer, but it also kept morale from nosediving faster than a cannonball. Imagine the riot if Blackbeard served up rotten tar instead of golden salted beef. Next up, let's talk about one of the rankest problems below deck, the smell. You've got 50 sweaty men crammed into tight quarters, temperatures nearing that of a jungle sauna, and about as much hygiene as a barnyard pig convention. Pirates obviously didn't have deodorant or even toothpaste, and the smell inside those ships was enough to make even the hardiest sailors reconsider their life choices. Here's something history books don't tell you. Pirates used to soak strips of old sailcloth in vinegar and hang them near their bunks. Sounds odd until you realize vinegar is basically nature's ancient air freshener and antiseptic, cutting down the nasty bacteria festering in the musty air. The acidity helped neutralize odors, kind of like today's air purifiers but with more ag and less electricity. Pirate crews, especially having to deal with the foot fungus and the pirate plague from earlier, found this method 70% effective at cutting the smell long enough to keep tempers from boiling over. Remember, fainting was a real danger in the heat, so clearing the air was a matter of survival, not vanity. Of course, not every attempt had success. One enterprising but slightly misguided buccaneer tried boiling a concoction of whale oil, crushed herbs, and rat droppings. Yes, rat droppings, thinking the pungent mix would somehow mask the stench. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. The smell went from eau de musketeer to bathtub sewage fest, and many pirates ran for the rigging rather than the galley. The stench was so bad, they even nicknamed the brew Barnacle's Revenge, which, if you think about it, is something nobody wanted to experience twice. Now, sanitation. Let's just say it wasn't a strong suit. Pirates largely relied on the side, meaning they relieved themselves overboard whenever possible. But in rough seas or during long periods in harbor, this wasn't an option. This led to the infamous slop bucket, a wooden pail that saw more use than most kitchen utensils on board. Pirates had theories about where to stash these, to the back of the ship, near the galley, or right by the powder store, and spoiler alert, all those ideas were equally bad. One captain even tried isolating the buckets under a covered hatch, thinking it might contain the smell. Let's just say letting 50 buckets of human waste stew underneath the same wooden floorboards as your gunpowder was a disaster waiting to happen. A particularly unlucky crew on the ship Fancy Fortune in 1723 suffered a spontaneous powder keg explosion, likely linked to methane gas buildup. Moral of the story: don't mix human waste with gunpowder unless you want fireworks, and not the kind that impress crowds. To keep things less deadly, pirates started scavenging sea sponges as primitive toilet paper, an idea that sounds cushy, until you realize those sponges were reused and passed around until they looked like something the dog dragged in. Talk about sharing in pirate life. Must have made mating season awkward. But hey, It was better than sandpaper on sensitive parts. Water was again key. They rinsed the sponges in seawater between uses. And while seawater isn't exactly germ-free, it's better than nothing, reducing bacterial growth just enough to prevent outbreaks of dysentery for a few days longer. This method increased sanitary conditions by an embarrassing but crucial 25%, which in the pirate life was a small victory worth boasting about over a bottle of grog. Now onto the pirate version of primitive medicine, because heat, dehydration, and disease are a brutal combination. Pirates had few medical supplies, mostly some rum-soaked cloths, questionable herbs, and a lot of wishful thinking, against infections caused by heat rash or small cuts turning into festering wounds. The legendary black tar salve was both a curse and a blessing. Made from tar mixed with animal fats and crushed herbs, it was sticky mess, but passed for medicine. Pirates smeared it on wounds hoping to block out air and bacteria. It probably did more harm than good, but oddly, some infections healed because tar has antiseptic properties. So, accidental win. The downside. Removing black tar from a wound was described in many logs as like peeling burnt leather from a sunburned skull, and led to many a pirate screaming louder than a parrot being fed hot peppers. Heat stroke was the silent assassin, and pirates learned pay attention fast. One notorious example was the 1704 voyage of Captain Anne Bonny, who nearly lost half her crew to heat exhaustion while trying to outrun a royal fleet near the Bahamas. The solution? Besides dousing heads in seawater and slapping, yes, slapping faces to keep people conscious, her crew developed a ritual of rotating shifts for rest below deck, where they'd use the coolest spot behind the cork-lined hull sections. This system maximized survival by keeping exhaustion and dehydration below deadly levels. Pirates didn't understand circadian rhythms or hydration science, but they understood people can only sweat so much before flatlining. Speaking of sweating, pirates came up with a disgusting but surprisingly effective trick to catch some relief: seawater baths. Huddled in tightly packed quarters, they'd pour buckets of cold seawater over themselves to simulate a sort of makeshift shower, which cooled their skin and sent a salty mist into the air. Contrary to modern advice, rinsing off sweat with salty water might sound like a recipe for a rash, but it helped reduce body temperature at least temporarily. Plus, it washed off grime, limiting some bacteria around skin folds. Of course, this method wasn't ideal for the ship's wooden interior. Water seeped into every crevice, bringing in rot and mold that only compounded the smell problem. The trade-off: cooler skin for a few hours in exchange for crusty floors and occasional fungal outbreaks so fierce they had nicknames like Black Toe, which wasn't the name of a pirate but a severe foot infection. Now, if you thought pirates were just throwing buckets of water on themselves blindly, think again. The seawater cooling ritual was part of a larger strategy involving pirate circulation. This meant rotating crew members between the stifling underdeck quarters and the exposed, windier decks so no one stayed in the sauna too long. Every 3 to 4 hours, someone took a turn baking and then swapped out. This wasn't luxury, it was survival, because exposure to fresh air not only cooled them down but helped reduce respiratory infections caused by breathing hot, mold-filled air. It worked well enough that Captain William Kidd reportedly kept a strict schedule during his voyages around Madagascar to keep his notoriously tough crew alive. And here's the kicker: pirates used their own sweat to sometimes save themselves. They'd smear their sweaty faces, arms, and legs with mud or a mixture of crushed herbs and seawater, kind of like a shady spa day gone wrong. This layer of mud evaporated slower than sweat alone, which kept them cooler by slowing down dehydration. Modern science calls this evaporative cooling, but pirates just called it pirate sweating. And if you think about it, it's pretty genius given the overhaul of leather armor and thick clothing they often wore. Unfortunately, this meant smelling like a swamp monster, which did wonders for pirate intimidation, but not so much for crew morale during close quarters. If you're wondering how pirates managed to keep their weapons and supplies from succumbing to the heat and humidity, prepare to be impressed. Pirates coated their guns and blades with a mixture of whale oil and soot to keep rust at bay. This greasy recipe acted as a primitive water repellent and reduced heat buildup on metal surfaces, making weapons less prone to malfunction in the sweltering conditions. One documented case from 1721 on the ship Revenge details how failing to maintain this coating during a hot spell resulted in multiple pistol misfires, which almost doomed a boarding action against the French Navy. Talk about life or death lessons learned the hard way. So by the time pirates made it through the baking torture chamber below deck, managed their stinky hygiene, kept some semblance of food and water, edible and fended off heat stroke, the true miracle was that they stayed vicious, feared, and functional enough to keep plundering. Turns out, surviving 60-degree hull heat wasn't just about sweating it out. It was about trial and error, desperate invention, and a whole lot of grim determination mixed with the odd, gross pirate hack. You might think pirates spent all their time swinging cutlasses or singing sea shanties, but honestly, they probably spent most of it figuring out how not to die from heat, thirst, and their own revolting habits. So next time you picture a pirate, don't just think swashbuckler and treasure. Think sweaty, smelly, stubborn survivalist genius who made hellish heat their daily enemy, and somehow still made it look badass. Now that's owning the pirate life.